I love him.
Do you?
No, I really do love him. I really love him. He's the man I love. But he doesn't feel that way about me.
Diane Keaton spent her life playing women who found love in unexpected ways. But off-screen, her own heart followed a quieter path. She never married, she never rushed, and she never forgot the men who once made her pause, wonder, and feel deeply. Before her death, Diane spoke, carefully, about 6 men she had deeply crushed on. Not affairs, not scandals, but connections that stayed with her long after the moment passed. Each name represents a different choice, a different road she could have taken, and a different version of the life she almost lived. In this video, we revisit those 6 men, not to judge, but to understand the woman behind the legend. Watch until the very end, because numbers 5 and 6 may truly surprise you. Their stories reveal a side of Diane few ever expected. Chapter 1. Jack Nicholson. When Diane Keaton spoke about love near the later chapters of her life, there was one name she never wrapped in humor or distance. Jack Nicholson was not a memory she softened for comfort. Their story began in the early 1970s, when Hollywood felt unfinished and emotionally reckless, and when both of them were still learning how much of themselves they were willing to give away. Jack was already magnetic, brilliant, defiant, unapologetically free. Diane, by contrast, was thoughtful, searching, and quietly unsure whether love was something she deserved or something she had to earn. What drew her in wasn't his fame or charm. It was his honesty. Jack never pretended to be safer than he was. "He doesn't hide," Diane once said. "What you see is what you get." For someone who had spent much of her life feeling like an outsider, that raw transparency felt intoxicating. They loved each other deeply, but not equally. Diane wanted commitment, stability, and the idea of building a life together. Jack refused marriage, refused promises, and refused to be reshaped by expectation. And still, she stayed. Years later, Diane said the sentence that explained everything. "He's the man I love, but he doesn't feel that way about me." There was no bitterness in her voice, only acceptance. Jack never became her husband, but he never fully disappeared either. He called, he checked in, he lingered. Their connection never closed cleanly, and perhaps that was the hardest part. Diane went on to love other men, but none carried the same emotional gravity. Jack became the quiet measure against which all future love was felt, not because he was perfect, but because he was real. Loving him taught her the cost of choosing passion without security. Some loves don't end. They simply change where they live. Chapter 2. Keanu Reeves. When Keanu Reeves entered Diane Keaton's life, it happened quietly, without drama or expectation. It was 2003, on the set of Something's Gotta Give, a film about love finding people later than planned. By then, Diane had already made peace with solitude. She had adopted her children, settled into independence, and learned how to live without waiting for anyone to choose her. Keanu arrived not as a disruption, but as a contrast to everything she had known before. He was younger, yes, but what struck her most was his gentleness. Diane had spent much of her life loving men who filled rooms with noise, ambition, and certainty. Keanu was different. He listened. He paused. He didn't rush to define himself or anyone else. In interviews, Diane struggled to explain him without smiling. "He's kind," she said simply, as if kindness itself were something rare enough to deserve reverence. Keanu carried grief quietly, the loss of his partner, and the child they never had. Diane sensed that weight immediately. It made him softer, more present. For her, that tenderness was disarming. Rumors followed them, as Hollywood always insists on turning affection into spectacle. Diane laughed them off, but not dismissively. On television, she once joked about marrying him, her tone playful, her eyes revealing something gentler underneath. It wasn't a declaration. It was a moment of honesty wrapped in humor. Nothing lasting came from it. timing never cooperates the way stories suggest it should. But Keanu left behind something meaningful. He reminded Diane that attraction didn't have to arrive with chaos, that warmth could exist without possession, and that even later in life, the heart could still recognize softness when it appeared. Some people enter our lives not to stay, but to show us a different way love can feel. Chapter 3. Mel Gibson. When Diane Keaton spoke about Mel Gibson, she wasn't talking about a relationship, a romance, or a future imagined. She was talking about a moment, one that surprised her by how deeply it stayed. Their connection began during the filming of Mrs. Soffel in 1984, a brooding, snow-covered love story built on tension and restraint. Mel was young then, intense, and undeniably magnetic. Diane was older, more guarded, carrying the quiet weight of loves that had already taught her caution. There was a scene where Mel's character shoots hers. In the stillness of the snow, he kisses her. It was scripted, it was rehearsed, and yet Diane later admitted it didn't feel like acting at all. "I kept replaying it in my mind for a year," she once said, almost startled by her own honesty. Not because it led anywhere, but because of how it made her feel. Seen, desired, fully alive in a single, fleeting moment. Diane later reflected on movie kisses with surprising conviction. People assume they're technical, awkward, meaningless. She disagreed completely. "They're worth it," she said. "They're why I became an actress." That kiss wasn't about Mel Gibson as a man she wanted to pursue. It was about what the moment unlocked inside her, the way he looked at her, the way his attention felt focused and sincere. For a brief second, the world narrowed, and emotion took over. Nothing followed once filming ended. No romance, no continuation, just memory. But sometimes memory carries its own power. That single experience reminded Diane that desire doesn't disappear with age. It waits, quietly, patiently, ready to surface when we least expect it. Some encounters are not meant to become stories, only reminders that the heart still knows how to respond. Chapter 4. Sam Shepard. When Sam Shepard entered Diane Keaton's life, it felt different from the beginning. There were no grand gestures, no cinematic sparks meant for an audience. Their connection unfolded quietly in the late 1970s, away from the flash of Hollywood headlines. Sam was a writer before he was anything else. Introspective, guarded, and deeply uncomfortable with attention. Diane, already familiar with louder men, found herself drawn to his restraint. Sam didn't charm rooms. He observed them. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried weight. Diane later described him as someone who understood solitude without trying to fix it. That mattered to her. She had spent years feeling like love required performance. With Sam, there was no performance, just presence. Their relationship was thoughtful, private, and emotionally serious. It didn't need to be explained to anyone else. What connected them most was their shared sense of being slightly out of place. Diane, often labeled quirky or unconventional, felt understood by Sam's refusal to conform. He wasn't interested in shaping her, improving her, or defining her. He accepted her contradictions without commentary. For a woman who had been told, directly and indirectly, who she should be, that acceptance felt rare. But quiet love has its challenges. Sam carried his own restlessness, his own internal storms. He belonged to wide-open spaces, to long stretches of silence that Diane sometimes found lonely. They cared deeply for each other, but their rhythms didn't always align. What bound them together also kept them apart. When their relationship ended, it did so without drama. No public heartbreak, no bitterness, just the understanding that not all meaningful connections are meant to last. Sam Shepard remained, for Diane, the man who taught her that intimacy doesn't always need noise. Some loves whisper instead of shout, and we remember them just as clearly. Chapter 5. Steve Martin. When Steve Martin entered Diane Keaton's world, it didn't arrive as romance, but it hovered close enough to be mistaken for one. Their connection grew quietly in the late 1970s and early 1980s, shaped by shared humor, shyness, and an almost identical way of observing life from the sidelines. Steve was wildly funny on stage, but off it, he was reserved, thoughtful, even cautious. Diane recognized that duality immediately, because it mirrored her own. They were close, very close, friends who understood each other without explanation. Both had built careers out of being slightly awkward, slightly misunderstood, and deeply intelligent. Diane once said that Steve made her feel comfortable in her own quiet. There was no pressure to impress, no need to perform charm. With him, she could simply exist. And that, for Diane, was rare. People often assumed there was more between them. Even years later, Steve admitted that they almost dated. That word, almost, carried weight. Timing never aligned. Their closeness lived in conversations, laughter, and emotional safety, not physical commitment. Diane later reflected that what she felt for Steve was not passion, but something gentler and perhaps more enduring. He represented the life that could have been peaceful, predictable, and emotionally kind. But peace, she learned, can be just as frightening as chaos. Both of them were guarded. Both were afraid of crossing a line that might cost them the friendship they valued so deeply. And so they didn't. They stayed in that in-between space, where affection lingers, but choice never arrives. Steve Martin remained one of the few men Diane trusted completely. Not as a lover, but as someone who understood her interior world. He wasn't the great love of her life. He was the safe one, the one who never hurt her. And perhaps that's why he stayed just out of reach. Some loves don't fail. They simply remain possibilities we choose not to test. Chapter 6. Steve Jobs. Among all the men Diane Keaton spoke about, Steve Jobs was the most unexpected, and perhaps the most revealing. Their connection did not come from Hollywood sets, scripts, or shared fame. It began quietly in the early 1980s through mutual friends in California, at a time when Steve was still becoming the visionary the world would later worship. To Diane, he was not yet a legend. He was simply different. They went on real dates. Diane later confirmed this with gentle amusement, recalling how Steve would pick her up in his car and take her to dinner. He wasn't charming in a traditional sense. He didn't flirt easily or fill silence with reassurance. Instead, he spoke carefully, intensely, as if every word needed to justify its existence. Diane found that strangely compelling. When he talked, she once said, you leaned in. What drew her most wasn't his ambition, but his clarity. Steve lived entirely in the future. Ideas, inventions, things that didn't yet exist. Diane, by contrast, lived in feelings, memories, and reflection. She noticed the difference immediately. He wanted to build something that would outlast him, she later reflected. I wanted to understand what lasts inside a person. That contrast fascinated her, but it also warned her. Steve reportedly spoke about marriage early, almost practically. Diane hesitated. She sensed that life with him would require orbiting his vision, not walking beside it. She admired his brilliance, but she valued her independence more. And so, she stepped back. Not dramatically, not painfully, just honestly. After Steve's death in 2011, Diane spoke of him with tenderness. He hadn't been a great love, but he had been a mirror. He forced her to ask what kind of legacy she wanted. Not devices, not empires, but connection, meaning, memory. Some people enter our lives not to be loved, but to clarify who we are, what she carried with her. Diane Keaton's life was never defined by who she married or who stayed. It was shaped by who touched her heart, even briefly, and what each connection taught her about herself. These 6 men were not trophies or regrets. They were moments of laughter, of longing, of clarity. Each one reflected a different version of Diane. The romantic, the observer, the woman choosing independence over certainty. She showed us that love does not have to last forever to be meaningful. Sometimes it simply has to be honest. As you look back on your own life, think about the people who changed you without staying. Those quiet connections often leave the deepest marks. If stories like this still move you, take a moment to subscribe. This channel is for those who believe memories matter and that some loves are meant to be remembered, not rewritten.